I'm very happy for this opportunity to meet you and be here in Chile. I've been hoping for a very long time to come here. So I think Edgar and I, 2 years ago, were discussing this, and I started my trip in Brazil, almost making it to Chile, and then the pandemic happened. And for the past 2 years, I've been hoping, praying that I'll be able to come back here, and now it's finally possible. I just want to say that for me personally, it's very important to go and meet people from around the world. And everything that I'm going to show you here in this very short time of 1 hour or less is the teaser, hoping that we can start a conversation. I want to know what you're doing. I want to know what you're interested in. I want to know how I can help you, me and the team that I will introduce in doing research, in doing open science, in doing judgment decision making. So all of this is open for collaboration, open for follow-ups. And hopefully next year I can come back for longer and we can do something a bit more following up on this. Given that we're doing open science, everything is shared and open, so you can scan this or you can download the slides over there. The URL will always appear here on the bottom, and then we share everything on YouTube and the Open Science Framework afterwards. If you want other open science talks, so I do quite a lot of those. They try to be on different topics, so you can go on YouTube and have a look at this. This is one of the very few good things that came out of the pandemic. It forced me to do everything on Zoom so I can record, and now everything is shared. So if something is interesting for you and you want to know more, this is where you can find it. I feel like it's important that every talk that we have should open with a slide like this, something of this scale, because for me, this is at the core of my identity and what I think is urgent in science, especially because we're in a time of a pandemic where science is so important. So we need to understand what works, what doesn't work, what is credible, what isn't credible. And the journey for open science started, at least for me, social psychology. I did my PhD in management, but now I'm in the psychology department. Started in 2011, where we understood that there are some challenges. So some things don't make a lot of sense. So there was a big paper called False Positive Psychology. There was a BEM paper about people being able to feel the future, which we know from physics or understanding of the universe is impossible. And since then, we understood that if these things are published, then maybe we start to question other things that are published in top-tier journals. So we started doing replications to see whether these things hold or don't hold. It took a few years, but finally in 2015, a few mass collaboration projects in social psychology came out, and this is when we realized we might have a problem. At the beginning in social psychology, when we saw that there are some problems with replicability, that some things don't replicate, other hard sciences said, oh, of course, it's psychology. It's not even a science, or it's a science of blah, blah. We don't trust anything else. But if we go to the hard sciences, things will be a lot more credible. So in 2015, psychology has challenged other domains, and they started doing replications as well. And then all these headlines started to come out, which is very discouraging because it made us understand that this is not a psychology problem, this is a science problem. And the problem is medicine stopped working for some reason. In a pandemic, how important is this? Now, the most recent one is cancer biology, a very big project with a very low replication rates. If we thought that maybe math, whatever is close to math, doesn't have a problem, so now we know that even in computer science, even in physics, quantum computing, we have a problem with reproducibility and replicability. So at the very least, we need to know that something very important is happening, and we need to understand this better. Now, I'm going to give you a very specific example from psychology, and this is about something called priming. So we thought that if we prime a certain concept, if we unscramble a sentence about elderly, then it does something to the mind, and then people behave differently. But in our mass collaboration about commitment priming, honesty priming, hostility priming, about death priming, so mortality salience, which is a very, very big theory, both in management and in social psychology, we fail. Mass collaborations, many labs from around the world try this again and again, and they fail to find support for priming. And also in singular replications, we fail to find support from this. Why am I showing you priming? Why this? Of all the things in social psychology, because of this guy. So everybody in behavioral economics, everybody in psychology knows this because he's the only psychologist that has ever received the Nobel Prize in economics. And he would have gotten this with Amos Tversky. There were a team that started the whole domain of heuristics and biases, judgment and decision making. And after receiving the Nobel Prize in 2002, they asked him, can you please summarize everything for us in a book? So he came up with Thinking Fast and Slow. It's not an easy book, let's admit this. Even I struggled to listen to this. First time when I opened it, like, wow, this is some dull stuff. And I'm in this domain. I can't imagine how other people are doing this. But in 2015-16, finally, I was able to listen to this as an audiobook. And I remember myself in the gym in the middle of the night listening to this. First chapter, great. Second chapter, great. Fifth chapter, sixth chapter, I had to stop my running and sit down and listen to this very carefully because he was covering all of these priming literature. And he realized in 2011 that he has a big problem because he came out with a book, a Nobel Prize winning person, saying that priming is trustworthy. And this is the promise of judgment and decision making. This is the promise of psychology. But now he has a problem because these things again and again fail to replicate. So in 2012, he wrote an email that became public since then. And he said, please, priming people, let's deal with the problem that your findings are not replicable. I ask you, please show me, because I published a book on this, the priming research works. So he says, all I have personally at stake is that I recently wrote a book that emphasizes priming research as a new approach to the study of associative memory. Count me in as a general believer. So Kahneman is a believer.
Yeah, so just a quick thing is that his research is not into priming.
It's not.
Just covering it as,
it's not.
In his book.
Right.
Yeah.
But he is a believer, and he thought that this is important enough to dedicate 1-2 chapters in his book about judgment decision making. But he saw that the failure to replicate is a train wreck looming. He said, you need to solve this to show me and everybody else that your priming thing works. In one of the blog posts that tries to analyze all the published findings in the book in that chapter, show that there's failure to replicate, Kahneman, who is 80-something years old, went on a blog post and wrote a comment. And this comment, I think, is remarkable because by 2017, when he wrote this comment, we already understood priming is a problem. And what he wrote is, what the blog gets absolutely right is that I placed too much faith in underpowered studies. The problem with priming is that these were conducted on samples of 20 in this condition and 20 in this condition. Now, there is spatial irony in my mistake because the first paper that he published with Amos Tversky was about this exact problem. What did he do? He went around to statistics conferences and he showed that even statisticians fall into this trap. So this allows researchers to trust the results of underpowered studies with unreasonably small samples. And this was written with Amos Tversky in 1969 and published in 1917. So even Kahneman, who warned the world about this, failed to see the problem with the priming research. So if Kahneman fell into this trap, we would fall into this trap as well. This is the paper that he published with Amos Tversky. And if you read their example that they gave to statisticians, it's almost exactly the same example as we can read in every priming study. So what does it have? Experiment on 20 subjects where the p-value is just below 0.05 with a z of 2.2. Right? So if you look at this, this is a classic example. We've all been citing this very many times, so over 4,000 citations. This is a classic. This was the foundations for the Nobel Prize. But we failed to understand the implications for us, for our research, because priming has a lot of citations, has a lot of publications. But now we understand, after over a decade of trying to replicate these things, that they don't hold. Now, he recently gave a talk in Edge where he says, okay, priming is dead. There's nothing about this. Just ignore my chapter over this. And he reflects on all sorts of other things. I won't go into that. So here he says priming research is effectively dead. But he also says this crisis, this replication crisis, is the best thing that could have happened because it's been the best decade methodologically in my lifetime. So Kahneman is realizing that we need to do more replications. And he said, I warned the priming literature people that they need to replicate this. So why didn't they take up my call? So over here, there were essentially no takers for the suggestion for priming researchers should proactively replicate each other's work. Now, if you think about this, we already identified one bias that Kahneman has. What other bias is reflected here? It's very easy to judge other people's literature. Looking at priming literature and say, oh, they have a problem, they should replicate. Did we replicate anything in judgment and decision making? Who picked up the call to replicate the Kahneman and Tversky, prospect theory and everything else? I did not see Kahneman saying, okay, now I'm going to focus on replications. He did not do what he was expecting other people to do. So this to me is an example of a very classic bias called the bias blind spot. You see biases in other people, but you fail to see biases in yourself. And Kahneman is a very good example because he's humble about this. He's able to self-reflect and say, yes, me too, I'm biased, therefore we should do this. But he didn't take this to the full extent, saying, yes, I'm biased, so we also need to look at my research, which is exactly what we started to do. We started to look into biases that are published in the literature, and one of our first replications was about the bias blind spot. So here you have the way that we replicate these things. You can see that I'm over here at the end, but all of these are my students. These are undergraduates, second year to fourth year at University of Hong Kong. They do this in my courses during a one semester. They come in with a very little understanding of methodology and statistics, but by the end of the semester, they've completed APA-style submission-ready manuscript with data collection, conducting high-level open science and rigor. And you can see over here is that all of these are students. My TAs also get co-authorship on this. And the first author is an invited early career researcher. It could also be you, and I'll tell you how you can do this as well. So after I finish the one semester with my courses, I go on Twitter and says, who wants to help us by leading this project to publication? Here you can see the coverage by the British Psychological Society. So this is, good news for science, but bad news for humanity that we all have a biased blind spot. And finally, published in Judgment and Decision Making not too long ago, so 2021. It's very easy to show biased blind spot because I show this in every one of my courses. This is one of the first exercises that I do with my students. I don't know if you can read this, but I ask them to rate yourself relative to the average classmate. So the classmates generally and all of them on average rate themselves higher than the midpoint on the positive things, and lower than the midpoint on the negative things. So positive things is like dependability, so I'm dependable. Bad things is, for example, how selfish I am or how deceptive I am. So they think that on average they're better than people on good things and worse than others on negative things. So this is a good example of bias blind spot. But what is even more important than this is even when I show this to them, I say, okay, this is a good example of a bias blind spot. And I follow up with even more. Over here, I say, please rate yourself and then rate the others. So this is after they already know about the bias blind spot. They still demonstrate the bias blind spot. And it replicates to me every time I do this in the classroom. So very strong effect of bias blind spot. And we all fall into this. So my question to Daniel Kahneman is, did you try and replicate your own work? We didn't. Who is going to replicate judgment and decision making? Why is this different from social priming? How do we know that what we're doing in behavioral economics and judgment decision making is better? We don't know, which is why we formed a team. So I do this with my students during the semester, and then we invite early career researchers from around the world to join us and take the lead on these projects. Now you can see this is a very big team. I never imagined in 4 years it will be this big. I already talked about 370 undergraduates, about 36 guided thesis students, undergraduates, and practical taught masters. But now we have all these people from around the world. You can see really a representation of almost every continent aside, unfortunately, from Africa. Hopefully next year I'll get to go there and invite them as well. 2 years ago when I visited Brazil, we had some Brazilian people started to working with us. Hopefully we'll find some more in Chile, but this is a growing team. And all of these are early career researchers, starting from masters up to about my level, assistant professor. So how many have we done? We've done about 80 with completed data collection and about 40 that are ongoing right now as registered reports. So if you think of the scale of this, if we work with our students, if we embed this into our classes, if we do this systematically, we have the potential of covering a lot of fundamental things in judgment and decision-making behavioral economics to address the issue of, how do we know? How do we really know that we are doing better than priming? So this is what we've done. If you want to see our reports, how well can undergraduates really do science? They do amazing work. I would even dare say that undergraduates are able to do better work than us because we've been in the system for a very long time. We've been brainwashed with all sorts of things that we now know are problematic in the scientific process, but these undergraduates don't know all these things. So for them, registered reports, that's a pre-registration, no problem. How come it's not part of the scientific system? So they're very eager to do this. Plus, there's something about perhaps the students at University of Hong Kong, which is considered to be one of the top universities in Asia, that are very, very motivated to succeed. So if you set the grades or the competition between them about open science practices rather than p-value lower than 0.05, then they do really well on this. So rather than training our students to do science the old-fashioned way of let's get some novel findings lower than 0.05, you train them to do registry reports, pre-registrations, and applications. You can go and have a look at all of this. We don't have time to look into this, but I just want to show you the sheer impact of this thing. I never imagined. We completed 180 plus 40 ongoing, but we're also able to bring these into journals. So as you can see, the model is all these underlines are undergraduate students. So they get a publication from a one semester course, undergraduate at the University of Hong Kong. All the first ones are early career researchers. So that's an opportunity for you. If you want to take over one of our completed projects, you can do exactly the same thing, followed by the TAs and then me really at the end. And we're able to bring this to all sorts of places where I never imagined. So for example, economics journal of economic psychology, a lot of top tier journals in social psychology like SPPS, JASP. So you can see that once we have the scale, we're also able to bring this to a publication. This is from this year, so from March, this is already updated. Plus right now, with all of my thesis students, I am doing a register report. So all of the theses are, by the end of the year, when they complete the thesis, all of those are going to be published. So we submit this as a register report. Before they start data collection, we get approval from a journal, what's called an in-principle acceptance. And only then we proceed to data collection, which means that they get feedback from real reviewers in a journal. And we work together with the community in order to bring what undergraduates are doing in their thesis in our course into publication at the end. We already received 2 in-principle acceptances, and I expect that all of these will get in-principle acceptance in the next 2 months. So you can see you can have a scale by also doing high rigor, high open science practices and bringing these to publications. If you want to look at replication rates, the replication rates for social psychology are considered to be somewhere between 30% and 50% for the top tier journals. And the effect size seems to be about half of what was published. If you look at judgment decision-making, I can say now, after we've completed quite a few of those, that actually a replicability rate for judgment decision-making classics, so this is not random sampling, I chose these classics, is pretty high. But aside from this saying something about judgment decision-making, I want you to really reflect on what this number means and what is inconclusive and what is this. Because who did this? These are undergraduate students at the University of Hong Kong conducting all the data collection on Amazon, Mechanical Turk, and Prolific Academic. So we were able to get very high rates when at the beginning, when I told people we were going to do this, they expected us to fail. Students doing replications on Amazon, Mechanical Turk, somebody at University of Hong Kong, this is not going to work. So we had some hostile reactions, but by now we know that something good is happening, not only because of successful, but also in the inconclusive and the unsuccessful, the students were able to realize all sorts of problems and opportunities for improvement. So looking at all sorts of moderators. So all these replications are actually replications and extensions where we look at additional moderators that might explain something if the replication fails. So even these the students have done a remarkable job at identifying why these might not work and how we can improve this in the future. If any of this sounds interesting to you, I've never said no to anybody, and we have a very big team. And we have a very large, long Google Doc. You can go and have a look at this. You can take over our completed replications with data collection, or you can work with us on register reports. Plus, we have a lot of resources. We have guides on almost everything, how to do pre-registration, how to calculate effect sizes. All of these are open and collaborative. So if you go in, first of all, use this. Second of all, if you see a mistake or if you want to update, you could just go ahead. And when we submit this to publication, you're automatically our co-author if you mention what it is that you've added. So all things are open, and this is how we work in the open science community. If you come in, you contribute, you use, you share, then you're a co-author, you're part of the team. I'm gonna briefly talk about confirmation bias, moving on from bias blind spot. Here you can see that a very famous YouTube blogger that I understand some of you are following. What's his name? Veritasium. Yeah. So he has 10 million, 15 million subscribers. So whatever paper we're going to publish, how many people are going to read this? Every video that this guy puts out gets so much exposure. And I love this video. This is from 4 months ago. And the title of the video was, "A physics professor bet me $10,000 that I'm wrong." So he published, he did a video on this car, and the car doesn't have any source of energy, but it shows that it only runs on wind, and the speed of the car is faster than the wind that's pushing it. And that's something in physics that he shows that is possible. But then comes a professor, Alex, from UCLA, can't get more Ivy League than a professor of physics in UCLA, and says, come on, what you showed in the video, that doesn't work. I know physics, trust me, this is impossible with physics. And then the interesting thing is that they decided to do a public bet on $10,000. So the physics professor, at some point, they had back and forth, and the YouTuber says, but just try this out. And the physics professor says, so let's just have a bet on this, and then $10,000. And they had some celebrities. I don't know if you're familiar with these figures, but they're big in science to make sure that everybody signs that they're going to test this out, and whoever is wrong is going to pay $10,000. Now, I really love this YouTube blogger because I love the way that he communicates science. And this is what he said, because if I am wrong, then I want to know. I'm willing to put $10,000 for somebody, a physics professor, to tell me where I went wrong, and I'm going to open everything that I'm doing. The whole point of this channel is to get to the truth. And we need to ask ourselves, are we willing to put our research to this kind of scrutiny? Are we willing to bet $10,000? I don't know. I'm very skeptical of most of the stuff that I read in the journals. So I love this approach. And I think we can get inspiration from science communicators and YouTubers about how we should conduct our own. Now, the thing that really blew my mind in this video is when we asked Alex, the YouTuber showed you evidence. There's evidence in the video showing that this runs faster than the wind. How do you explain this? So what does the professor says? This is unconscious bias. They don't realize, the YouTuber doesn't realize that he's causing the effect. And I have to say, when I looked at this is the way that we explain, failed replications and all sorts of other things. It's like we understand there's bias, experimental bias, and he's introducing, so he's saying when the YouTuber is running this, he's actually causing the effect without even knowing this. I won't go into how, but you can go and have a look at this. So he said the reason for this is unconscious bias. But now we know, after Kahneman, that there's bias blind spot. He could see very easily bias in other people, but he failed to see the bias in himself. And what is the result? The YouTuber was right. And it's so easy to see that the YouTuber is right because you can just replicate this for peanuts. You don't need $10,000. You just need, some kind of 3D model machine to put it. And he took another YouTuber who just designed this, and they showed that this totally works. And now if you want to replicate this as well, they have the model, you can download this, you can print this, a 3D printer, and then you can see this and have a look at the video. So, oh my God, a physics professor from an Ivy League university against a YouTuber. is completely wrong. So my own takeaways, the professor at any time, before betting $10,000 and assuming that the other person is biased and doesn't know physics, you could have tried this, just replicate this. Like how difficult is it to replicate the Kahneman and Tversky prospect theory or the statistics in statistician conferences? It's so easy to go and replicate this. I do this with undergraduate students, so why can't we as a community do this? So I see all kinds of biases over this. There's hubris. We think that we're better than others, so better than average effect, especially if you're in academia. There's a biased blind spot where we see very easy for us to see in other people, but we don't do this about ourselves. But also confirmation bias. You only look at the evidence that supports what it is that you believe in. And confirmation bias is very, very bad in science. And I'm going to show you one other example. First, we also conducted a replication of confirmation bias. This is not published yet, but you can see that across different kinds of interventions and all sorts of things, we can't really get confirmation bias to be de-biased. But across all of these, we get very consistent effects for this. So we couldn't find support for the theory of how to de-bias, but we find support for confirmation bias. So we did a replication of this as well. So it's not only that I see YouTube videos and then I say, there's confirmation bias. I want to test this by myself to see to what extent I or the community have confirmation bias. So we tested this as well. This is Dorothy Bishop. She's a big name in science. And she studies how scientists can stop fooling themselves, how we have all sorts of overcoming cognitive constraints in improving research. This is what I'm talking to you right now. So why am I showing you her? Because she has a talk where she describes a meta-analysis that she did, where she says that she completely neglected, she forgot to include one of the evidence that goes counter to what the point was in our meta-analysis. So if the person who tells us about cognitive biases goes and in this talk shares from her own experience that she's also prone to confirmation bias, and she forgot about this paper to include this in a meta-analysis in a systematic review. And this happens to her. It's really ironic because I sort of managed to mentally suppress its existence of this one thing that goes against. But the irony is that that study was by her PhD student. Even if she knows that from her PhD student, she doesn't, in the memory, she forgets. So we have all these, so we cherry pick in our meta-analysis. We do all sorts of different things. If there's a new study, we look at this and we say, does this validate my preconceived beliefs? If yes, it must be a good study. If no, it must be a bad study. I'll find all the flaws and then bad study, and then I was right all along. So, so there's all sorts of consequences to this, how to battle confirmation bias. We tend to trust citations. We cite all sorts of supportive materials, but we don't cite anything that goes counter to us. Very difficult to debias. And then there are all sorts of ways for us to overcome this bias. But first, we need to understand as researchers that we need to really address this. Hindsight bias is also a very, very strong bias. I won't go into this because we don't have a lot of time, but hindsight bias is this bias about, I knew it all along. And we get this so many times from reviewers. You get this as well. It's like, what's surprising about this? I knew this all along. Did you really? Because when I read the study, I didn't know what I was going to find out. And when I give this to people and I don't tell them what the outcome is, half of them will say this and half of them will say that. But when we see the outcome, suddenly everything seems as if we knew this all along. So we did hindsight bias replications of two classic studies from the 1970s, and we found very consistent, robust effects. But the early career researcher, so Jiang Chen, said, I love these replications, but can I please add another study? And I'm like, yes, please add something. So she did a study to study hindsight bias over the replicability of hindsight bias. What does that mean? We anticipated that the reviewers are going to tell us, of course, hindsight bias replicates, because we knew this all along, because it's such a great study. Did you really? So we showed them that when people try to predict whether hindsight bias will replicate or not, depends on whether they saw the outcome as successful or failure. And we were able to, I love the study that she did over here. It's terrific because it's ironic. And I think the reviewers understood the irony in all of this. So this was a very smooth kind of approval in JSP. And we were able to show that if we tell them that hindsight bias failed, then they say, oh yeah, I knew this is gonna fail all along. So they reduce their estimates, and if we tell them it's successful, they increase their estimate. So terrific study. But if we think about this, this has consequences for the way that we do publications.
So I wonder what's the name of the paper.
Sorry?
I'm wondering what's the name of the paper, what's the title?
Oh, this is the paper, Retrospective and Prospective Hindsight Bias Replications and Extensions of. Yeah, so go and have a look. That's the link over there. So it's already published in JSP, yeah, a year ago, last year. So we need to reflect on this, what this means, and we need to understand that when we give something to review, we should really hide the outcome. We should only show them introduction and methods and ask them, is this rigor? Without showing them the results, because the results should be completely blind, which is what we do with registered reports. We also have outcome bias. So if a replication failed or succeeded, affects the way that we perceive people to be competent or not competent. So the first one in the 1980s was shown about medical decision-making. So if the patient died or the patient lived, affects the same kind of decision. People would say, oh, it's a bad decision because he died, or it's a good decision because, but actually the decision is exactly the same, but you can't evaluate the decision based on the outcome because there's always a chance of something succeeding or failing. So we replicated this. This is outcome bias. This is now in process. Has implications for the way that we do science. Failed replication, successful replication. People assume that if we fail to replicate something, it's like you're incompetent. You didn't do this correctly because they're from Princeton, and they've done this. They're big. They did a TED talk, and you didn't. Therefore, you're incompetent. If it's a success or it's p-value lower than 0.05, then success. It means that you know something. But this is a big bias in the way that we look at this. All sorts of other things. I wanted to bring this to you because I think it's especially, I see this in Hong Kong, in the way that we hire our faculty. And I try to get my department to do this differently. Because one of the reasons that these biases affect us is that we hire the wrong people. Rather than having them emphasize open science, things like power, for example, then we emphasize the number of publications that they have. And this is a very bad way of establishing whether science is solid, whether a researcher program is solid. Because if you look at these two candidates, they both have the same kind of resources. They both have 2,000 participants. They both have a 50% a priori true hypothesis. They both have comparable research designs. The only difference between these two is that one of them published 33 statistically significant papers, and the other one published 21 statistically significant papers. Which one would you hire? Every department would say A. What's the problem? It doesn't take into account power because they both have the same kind of resources, but one of them used much smaller samples. So if you look at this, we published 33 statistically significant papers. It means that per condition, there's 25 subjects, whereas the other one says, I want larger samples because I want to ensure that I have enough power. So if we try to convert this to what are the replicability rates, we would see that actually the candidate A has much higher false positive results, and only 25% of the results can be replicated. But the second one, who took the time, who invested in power, published less but did better science, is less likely to be hired but did much more replicable science. So there's something for us in the way that we hire faculty, in the way that we do promotions, in the way that we emphasize science overall. We really need to move away from quantity and move into quality. Is there open science? Did they take into consideration power? We did all sorts of things about default. I won't go into this, but we also did replications on this. Lots of interesting stories for me to share about this. I just want to say that I also showed online live when I did a workshop on pre-registrations and register report. We did live on ourselves saying, if we set the defaults to be pro-open science or against open science, we can say that people say that if the default is for no open science, they will do less open science. Not very surprising, right? But we don't take this into account because we don't emphasize and we don't set the default. I'm not saying force everybody to do open science. I'm just saying, as a journal, as a department, let's set the defaults. Let's learn from our judgment decision-making to set the defaults to do open science. And then you'll see that almost everybody wants to do open science. This is their default. Just make it easy for them to do open science. And I show this about many other things. To summarize, this is a book that came out by Chris Chambers, 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology. So we have these sins and we need to be aware of them. So we have outcome bias, we have confirmation bias, we have publication bias, we have hindsight bias, many things in science. This came in 2015. Since then, we know this is not psychology. This is not 7 sins of psychology. This is sins of science. So by now, we know that this is a general problem with us being human. Even if science is perfect, us being human, we have weaknesses. We, especially as social psychologists, behavioral economists, we need to know and take this into effect. Last thing I want to say about solutions, very briefly. Initial solutions that I decided for myself is open everything up. Share everything publicly, incentivize assessments. We started doing assessments. At the first semester in 2019, we took published findings and I asked the students to tackle this, to look at all the data, the code, make sure that everything is reliable. And then when I shared this, people are saying, oh, you're doing this for others, but you're not doing this for yourself. And I said, good point. I'm also biased. From 2020, all the students in each semester do assessment of the previous semester students. So in 2020, they looked at this student. In 2021, they looked at that student. And we were able to find a lot of mistakes. So we need assessments again and again. And this model is working. We can train our undergraduates to look at science and find all sorts of weaknesses in order for us to improve. Plus, and I've implemented this based on Veritasium and the YouTube blogger, I said, I'm going to put money behind this. Please check me, replicate me on my website. I put this thing. I want you to replicate my work. I want you to help me find issues. I'm going to pay you for this. So I paid $5 for a minor mistake, $50 for a major mistake, because I don't want in 20 years to realize that a lot of people have tried to build on my findings and failed because I made a mistake. We're all human. We're all making mistakes. The only way for us to battle this is open everything up and ask people to help us. And as you can see, I told my students, not only are you doing assessments, but if you find errors, I will pay you. And this semester, I had to pay them a lot of money. So this translates lately to $250, which they all donated this to GiveWell. So GiveWell, Effective Altruism won, Science won, Students won, we all won together, having a good feeling and contributing to better science. Another solution is register reports. I will not go into register reports in detail. I just want to very briefly say our publication process right now is broken. We've shown there's enough meta-scientific evidence to show that this doesn't work because of hindsight bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias. And the problem is that we don't catch peer review. Doesn't happen at the right time. Peer review only happens after we collected the data, after we wrote out everything, after we left out things in the file drawer, after we harked, after we p-hacked, after all of that, rather than doing registered reports, which has 2 stages. First stage is after the pre-registration, so you just have a plan. After you and the reviewers work together positively, constructively, to get to the best design, once we all agree that this design is good, they give us in-principle acceptance. It means it doesn't matter p-value above 0.05, lower than 0.05, then it gets published, in-principle acceptance. And the only thing that happens in the stage 2 is, did you follow the plan? If you did not follow the plan, did you justify this and explain all your deviations? And now everything that I do with my students is register reports. This is the future. This is where we should go. This eliminates all the hindsight bias, outcome bias, confirmation bias, and so forth, because you work differently. And then rather than reviewers being hostile and against you, they work with you. Rejection rates for registered reports drop from, let's say, MJ, JAP, or between 90–95%, drop to 10% or less. So suddenly you don't need to try this journal and then try this journal and then try this in 5 years until something gets published. We're able to publish registered reports within 1 year from beginning to end. I do this with my thesis students. So we're able to address all of this with registered reports. And from 2012, this year, everything that I do with my students in a thesis is registered reports with a schedule track. This is a revolution in science, registered reports right now in the peer community and registered reports guarantees peer review within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And we're shifting from the big publishers, all these Springer, Elsevier, and all of that, we're moving to the community. So open science movement, the open science community is creating amazing solutions that we should look at. And this thing is a revolution. Review under 2 weeks. This is why I'm able to do this with my thesis students. And I'm working with Chris Chambers, and it's been really a humbling experience. Plus, I was able to get, for the first time, I was able to get support from the university, because the university knows that it will only fund in principle acceptance thesis, in principle acceptance projects. So they don't have any risk anymore. The risk went from maybe it will get published, we don't know, to guaranteed publications, because they already have in principle acceptance. And these are all the students that are working with me on this. This is very briefly a teaser to a lot of things that we're doing. If you want to know more about what we're doing, if you want to know more about the team, about the replications, meta-science, meta-analysis, the workshop that I gave, the talks, everything that we've been doing, this is the grand link, or you can scan this code. I really want to talk to you about these things. So if anything about this is interesting to you, there's many ways to get in touch with me. I think Edgar knows that I'm very active on Twitter, so I really try every step of the way, anything that happens with me or my students or the team, to put this on Twitter, so you can follow me over here. We have a mailing list, so every time I give a talk or every time there's a publication, there's something, resource, that you can subscribe to this here, and it will give you, every 2 months, I give out an update about these things. My website has everything about my activities, and I try to be as open and transparent about everything. But sometimes you also want like a personal touch. So if there's something specific about you that you want to talk to me about, I try to be very responsive, given the travels around the world. So please do get in touch with me on my email and let me know how me, my team, students can work together with you in order to help you in your science and open science journey. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have one question. We touched about on this earlier, but I wanted to talk to you about authorship. And when you have multiple authors in a paper, there are some very specific guidelines, for instance, in the American Psychological Association, about what does it mean to make an intellectual contribution to a paper. And your model seems to transgress that principle, in that maybe you have such a little part in this vision that you cannot claim that you are intellectually responsible for the outcome of these works. So I was wondering, how do you respond to those?
No, terrific. So first I want to say that all these things we debate together in the open science community. So if you join us on the Twitter sphere and you raise this question, we will show you first the solutions that we have. Second, we will try together and figure out a way to address this. And when we started as the open science community, doing these mass replication projects and mass collaboration, this is the first thing that came up. People say, but how do you know that this person really contributed? Should they be a co-author or not should they be a co-author? Are there maybe too many people on this paper? Because we're used to 1, 2, 3, 5 maybe, but not 8, not 20, not 100. So in the open science community, we've promoted something called credit contributorship. So we want to know exactly who contributed what to what extent. So if you look at any of our preprints, in the first 5 pages, 2 of the pages detail all the contribution, who did what and to what extent. And with that contributorship, we're trying to work together with journals in order to embed this so that it's very clear who did what. And if you have a problem, let's say with methodology, if you have a problem with something in the code, then you know who to address and where you can get your support from this. But it's very important for us, first of all, not only looking at the negatives of this can be abused, but also looking at the positives of everybody who contributed should get credit for this. Also, when we use R packages, we try to give credit by using citations. Now that we have open peer review as part of registered reports, we want to acknowledge our reviewers, to thank them for helping us do better. So as science, we need to move from the traditional thinking of, there's typically one lead author, one corresponding author, and the rest, maybe looked at the paper before revision. So there shouldn't be a lot of us. Now we need to move from individual labs into mass collaborations, and we need to update our understanding of what a contribution is. And we need to be very transparent about who contributed what. So definitely we need to update this model, and we're working on this, especially in social psychology. This is now a given. So starting from Nature, Human Behavior, JPSP, Psychological Science, into all of the smaller journals, now we use contributorship. So we're trying to update this model, and we're trying to be as transparent as possible. And we also try to ensure that we stick to some of the regulations by some of the societies so that people don't feel like it's being abused. I can say, at least from our project here, I think it's more complicated with the mass collaborations like Psychological Science Accelerator and the many labs. This is a different issue, but at least here, I can say for a fact that both the students and the TAs and the early career researchers all have contributed into making this a reality. Without each and every one of them, the project would not be possible. And if you look at any of our preprints, we explain exactly who did what. And because we're open science, you can see all of our process. You can even follow the tweets to see this person did that, then that person came in, and then so the nice thing about open science is that it makes things, you don't need to guess, because everything is so open and transparent. And then finally, the editor can make a decision about, is this reasonable or not reasonable? And I think especially in our case, this is very reasonable. It's a good model to work with, where we can see that we need to acknowledge our TAs, our RAs, everybody who contributed needs to be acknowledged in this, because they've contributed to the success. It's not just the PI who did everything, and one person who deserved the credit, but all the people behind did something that was very important for the project. But I agree that this should be part of the debate or the discussion that we're having. We're having this in the open science community. We're hoping that some of the journals and the publishers and all that will join us. And some of them have already started and are implementing this.
So we talked also earlier about this, but so what's your experience in terms of the reactions of journalists and in terms of psychology on the one hand and perhaps management on the other hand, in which you also have experience?
Yes. It's a process. I'll start with psychology, because in psychology, we really map out all the journals. I don't decide what to target where we submit. The early career researcher could be you. If you join, I ask you for your career or your preferences, where do you want to submit this? So the reason why we publish in Journal of Economic Psychology is not because I really care about this journal, but because the lead author said it's on our list. So I need this. I said, yeah, let's try. I don't know how it's going to work out. Honestly, I was very skeptical about this, but turns out that they're very accepting towards this. And now I think we have 3 already published, and then another one coming in. So they surprised me. It's very possible that other journals will surprise me, but now, at least in psychology, I have a good understanding of what's happening. And I can say that in general, in the top tier, what's considered to be top tier social psychology, like JSP or SPPS, our success rate is about 40–30%, something like that. But the more that you move towards the open science supportive journals, then the rates increase. And in the last year, my general, when I do this with my students, let's say that there's no early career researcher, we try and submit to the Diamond Access, no fee, open science journals. So they're not the highest impact factor, but I think these are the most ethical, because we share everything and they're very transparent about everything. And then we don't hide this from the taxpayers. They don't need to pay again in order to access what it is that they paid for, because everything is publicly available. But in social psychology, things are changing. It's getting easier and easier to publish applications, but it's not perfect. So I have a lot of discussions. Some of them are even with the open science community about what replication should be published. Should every replication be published? To what extent it should be published? And it's an ongoing debate. But I would say that there are certain things that you can do with your application in order to increase the chances of this being accepted. So for example, doing a replication and extension really helps, because this addresses some of the need for contribution. So then you can say, okay, I took a theoretical idea, and instead of doing my own design from scratch, I just built this on the foundations of something that was already tested. And then I can see both if the foundations are solid and whether the way that I tested the extension, the theoretical contribution, is solid or not. So you can increase that sort of thing. If you work in a mass collaboration, or you test this in different places, let's say you want to run something in Chile, but you think maybe a Hong Kong sample is going to be good for you. So if you collaborate with us and we also collect something in Hong Kong, this will increase the chances because people see that you're more rigorous and you capture more of the world. So collaboration is really coming to part. And there's all sorts of things that you can do in terms of meta science, insights, and that we're trying to do. This is in terms of the psychology part. Management is a struggle for me. I have to say that until now, I don't know how to get replications into management journals. I think management is about 5 to 10 years behind, but there's some good signs that things are changing. So for example, talking about register reports, some of the journals in management have already endorsed register reports. So Leadership Quarterly editor seems to be a very open science friendly person and implementing this. We have MOR, which is a little bit like Asia focused, but has registered reports, Journal of Business and Psychology. And there's like 5 or 6 already that are implementing this. But I can already see that editorial board of HTP is making some big changes, and hopefully more will come. I am working as much as I can with business schools in order to try and see what's happening, and I can see a change. I can see more discussion about this, but it's a little bit lagging behind. The big change that's going to come next year, right now, there's DARPA score. So the American Army, Navy forces decided that they want to know, without doing replications of the entire literature, they want to know what is reliable and what is not. So they decided not just psychology, but they do this with economics and they do this with management to sample different ones. So they do this on 3,000 papers. The outcomes from these replication projects is going to come next year. And I think this will be the big bang, I think, that management and economics need in order to push them to understand what are the replicability rates and how to improve these kinds of things, which is kind of what we experienced in 2015. So there is some hope that these massive shifts, external shocks, are going to happen also to economics and to management. So I'm hopeful. I am almost a little bit hesitant, but I'm almost certain that this is irreversible. I cannot see really even management reversing to the old practices of saying, oh, we don't care about sharing, we don't care about registration, we don't care about power, we don't care about these things, because these are now so widely debated, and there's so many mass collaboration projects looking at these, like DARPA score, that are really going to convince people that this is needed. If we train our students and they're going to be in the job markets in 5-10 years, we owe it to them to try and understand what's happening and train them so that they will be ready for after these external shocks are going to happen to management. So we have to embed this within the management department. So the few business schools that I work with, let's say in Hong Kong and France and some other places in the world, we're trying already to introduce what we know in psychology to what is happening in OBM management. But yeah, too slow, too little, but hopefully with time, maybe not in our academic lifetime, but definitely our students or the next generation, maybe they will benefit from better, more open science.
Yeah, I think one thing that will make it slower is that psychology is super oriented towards lab studies. Meanwhile, management and even specialty are pushing towards field studies, which is by definition you cannot replicate because one firm is different from the other, and therefore you need to invest in not in replicating, but rather in having pre-registration and in the initial stages, basically. Yeah, so we want more replicability is not something that you can push.
Yeah, I tend to think of this as exactly the opposite from my humble view. So let's say before I address management, neuroscientists, say for example, in my department, we have a lot of neuroscientists and they say, come on, power, really? Do you know how much it costs us to put somebody in the scanner? Do you know how many person hours? We can have samples of 20, 30. If you go to developmental psychologists, educational psychologists, bringing babies, do you know how difficult it is to do an experiment on babies? How do you expect 200, 1,000 participants? You collect this in 1 hour on Amazon Mechanical Turk. We invest years in this. Our response to this is you have to work collaboratively. And you have to work with registered reports in order to make sure that even when you have small samples, combining many small samples from around the world, that you know how to conduct this. So what registered reports and open science offers you is that first you do a plan, that plan gets accepted into a journal, just a plan, and then you can come with a plan and say, I have a publication. Who wants to join me? Then rather than gambling on 2 years, 3 years of work and getting participants, 20, maybe 30 participants, now you can have mass collaborations. All of them are joining because they know that there's already a publication. And suddenly you move from large-scale collaborations that have large samples on a pre-registered plan. So this allows you to really scale up, and it's much easier to get funding from the funding agencies when you have the in-principle acceptance saying no risk, zero risk for you because this is going to get published, for them to support this. I think it's also the same for management and in this field. Field studies are so costly and there's such high investment that really only if you come from a well-developed economy with endless resources from the Ivy League can you really do this. But this has the potential for really equalizing everything among all of us. We come from countries that don't have access to all these means, and we want to know that we're able to participate in this. Registered reports and open science allow us to do this because once you have registered reports, once you have in-principle acceptance over a plan, then you can get funding, then you can get mass collaborations, then you can get many people from around the world to do things differently, and then you have more reliability and everybody benefits from this. So I think rather than just going into one field, one context, one company, we really need to move into a model of registered reports and mass collaborations with funding authorities that approve a good, solid plan that would allow us to gain some insights from this. So if anything, I think more than for social psychology, registered reports and open science are the big opportunity for all of us to improve, especially in neuroscience where the samples are very small, especially for educational babies, very small, especially with management that has a big problem with high investment over very high risky, low rates of publications. Can really shift everything around if you work with this kind of model. So I think it offers a lot of hope rather than anything else. But this is stuff that we're trying to figure out. So when we go around the world or on the Twitter sphere, we try to talk to people in the field to understand what is required, how can we aim to improve all of those. And I think just in general, the reaction from the community, let's say when you talk to a person from the street and you explain to them what is the publication model, how we get incentivized, how we get promotions, how we hire, who gets the funding, they don't like it. They want to know that their money is well invested and that the insights that they can draw from your studies are very generalizable. So we need to move from these very small samples with very weak evidence that we communicate on TED or write books on to really having a lot more solid and a lot more large-scale studies. So hopefully, I don't know, but we're trying to work with management partners to understanding. I think it's especially important that if we already do something in the field, that we come and ensure that it's high rigor and that it's 100% publication guaranteed, rather than let's just try many things and see what works out. This is the right model in my mind.